Between 1872 and 1891, 17 men disappeared without a trace across 3 counties in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia. They vanished from their homes, from forest roads, from town squares in broad daylight. No bodies were ever recovered. No ransom demands were made. The only connection between these men was something the authorities refused to document in official records. Each victim had been involved in violent land seizures against Melungeon families during the previous 3 decades. Local newspapers barely mentioned the disappearances, and county sheriffs closed investigations within weeks, citing lack of evidence. But in the isolated valleys of Newman's Ridge, whispers spoke of something else entirely. A reckoning that had been planned with the patience of mountain stone, executed with surgical precision, and hidden behind a wall of silence that even death could not break. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from sealed court documents, private journals discovered in abandoned homesteads, and testimony given in hushed voices by descendants who still live in those mountains. Before we continue with the story of Newman's Ridge and the men who never came home, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, real mysteries buried by time, don't get told anywhere else. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you are listening from. I want to know how far these forgotten American stories are reaching. Now let us go back to a time when justice wore a different face, and vengeance was measured not in moments, but in generations. The truth of what happened begins not with the disappearances themselves, but with understanding who the Melungeons were, and why their story became one written in blood and silence. Newman's Ridge rises from the Tennessee landscape like the spine of some ancient beast, its forested slopes concealing valleys where even sunlight seems reluctant to linger. In the 1840s, when land-hungry settlers began pushing deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, they encountered communities that defied every assumption they held about race, origin, and belonging. The Melungeons had been there longer than anyone could remember. Families with names like Collins, Gibson, Goins, and Mullins, speaking English with an accent that sounded almost Elizabethan, their skin ranging from olive to bronze, their eyes sometimes startlingly blue or green against dark hair. They were not white by the standards of the day, nor were they enslaved. They were not recognized as Indian, though some claimed Cherokee or Portuguese ancestry. They existed in a liminal space that 19th century America found intolerable. In a society increasingly obsessed with racial classification, especially as tensions over slavery mounted, the Melungeons represented something dangerous: ambiguity. The community that lived along Newman's Ridge and nearby Blackwater Creek in Hancock County, Tennessee, numbered perhaps 300 souls by 1850. They farmed the steep hillsides, raised livestock, hunted the forest their grandfathers had hunted. They kept largely to themselves, attending their own churches, educating their children in small schoolhouses hidden in the hollows. They were skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths, coopers, weavers, and their work was valued even by those who refused to eat at the same table with them. But they owned land, good land. And as white settlement intensified after the Mexican War, as railroads began snaking through Tennessee, as timber companies eyed the virgin forests of the Appalachians, that land became a target. The legal assault began quietly. Melungeon families found their property deeds challenged in court, with judges ruling that people of mixed blood could not legally own property under certain interpretations of Tennessee law. Surveyors redrew boundary lines, often with the backing of wealthy landowners from Knoxville and further east. Families who had farmed the same plots for 3 generations suddenly found themselves trespassing on their own soil. Vardry Collins was 47 years old in 1852 when he lost his 100-acre farm to a legal maneuver he could barely comprehend. The land had been in his family since before Tennessee was even a state. He had the original grant, signed by a territorial governor, but the circuit court judge in Sneedville ruled that the deed was invalid because Collins could not prove he was white. The farm was sold at auction for a fraction of its value to a speculator named Ephraim Dalton, who had connections to the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. Vardry Collins did what he could through legal channels. He traveled to Knoxville, hired a lawyer who took his money and filed motions that went nowhere. He wrote letters to the governor that were never answered. And when Dalton arrived with a dozen men to take possession of the property, Collins gathered his wife and 7 children and watched his home, the cabin his grandfather had built from chestnut logs, burn to the ground. They said Collins started the fire himself rather than let Dalton have the house. Maybe he did. No one was ever charged. The Collins family moved higher into the ridge, building a rough shelter on land too steep and rocky for anyone else to want. Vardry Collins lived another 11 years, dying in 1863 while the Civil War raged through Tennessee. He died of pneumonia, brought on by years of living in inadequate shelter. His wife, Rebecca, followed him 6 months later, but his sons remembered. Zachariah, the eldest, was 19 when they lost the farm. He watched his father diminish year by year, watched the light go out of his mother's eyes. He remembered every detail of that day, the smirk on Ephraim Dalton's face, the names of the men who had enforced the eviction, the way the flames had consumed everything his family had built. And Zachariah Collins was not alone in his remembering. Between 1852 and 1865, while the nation tore itself apart over slavery, at least 40 Melungeon families in Hancock County and neighboring Lee County, Virginia, lost their land through similar legal theft. The Civil War barely touched these remote valleys. Neither Union nor Confederate forces saw much strategic value in the steep ridges, but the war provided cover for even more aggressive land grabs. With county records in chaos and courthouses sometimes changing hands between military occupations, titles were shuffled, deeds went missing, and surveyors redrew maps to favor those with connections and capital. In 1859, a timber company based in Rogersville purchased 30,000 acres in the region, much of it land that Melungeon families had occupied for generations. The company used a combination of legal pressure and outright intimidation. Homes were burned, livestock was driven off or slaughtered, there were beatings, there was worse. In June of 1861, 17-year-old Sarah Goins was attacked while walking to her family's cabin after visiting a neighbor. 2 men from the timber company's logging camp grabbed her on the forest path. She fought. They were seen dragging her into the trees by a 10-year-old boy who was too terrified to do anything but run home and tell his father. By the time Calvin Goins and 4 other Melungeon men reached the site, Sarah was barely alive. She survived, but she never spoke again. Not a word for the remaining 34 years of her life. The men who attacked her were never arrested. The county sheriff, a man named Porter Hensley who owned shares in the timber company, said there was insufficient evidence. When Calvin Goins tried to file a complaint with the circuit court, he was told that testimony from colored persons was not admissible against white men. Sarah's brother, Isaac Goins, was 14 years old that summer. He sat by her bedside for weeks while she lay broken and silent. He held her hand, while doctors who charged his father everything he had tried to save her mind, along with her body. He watched his father age a decade in a single season, and Isaac Goins remembered. By 1865, when the war finally ended, Newman's Ridge had become a place of long memories and silent rage. The Melungeon community had lost land, dignity, and innocence. They had learned that the law would not protect them, that appeals to justice were futile, that they existed outside the boundaries of the social contract that supposedly governed civilized society. But they had not lost everything. They still had each other. They had their tight kinship networks, their knowledge of the mountains, their ability to move through the forests like shadows. And they had something else, something that would prove more dangerous than any weapon. They had patience. On a cold evening in November 1865, 6 men gathered in a hunting cabin deep in the hollows of Newman's Ridge. The cabin belonged to Zachariah Collins, now 32 years old, married with 3 children of his own. With him were his younger brothers, Thomas and John Collins. Isaac Goins, now 18, was there, as was his cousin, Martin Goins. The sixth man was Daniel Mullins, whose family had lost 200 acres to a fraudulent survey in 1857. They met by firelight, away from their families, away from anyone who might later claim they had heard anything. What was said in that cabin was never written down. But over the following months, other men joined these meetings, always in secret, always in locations that changed from gathering to gathering. Never more than 8 or 9 men at a time. They called themselves nothing. They kept no records. They made no oaths that could be betrayed. But among themselves they understood they were going to take back what had been stolen, and they were going to make sure that those who had destroyed Melungeon families paid a price that could never be adjudicated in any court. What they planned was not random violence. It was not blind vengeance. It was something colder, more deliberate. They would target specific men, those who had profited most directly from Melungeon suffering, those who had participated in the violence, those who had wielded the law like a weapon. They would take these men quietly, leave no evidence, and ensure that the disappearances could never be connected to Newman's Ridge. And they would wait, years, if necessary. Because vengeance, they had learned, was a dish best served with the patience of mountains. The first name on their list was Ephraim Dalton, the man who had taken Vardry Collins' farm and burned his home. Ephraim Dalton prospered in the years after the Civil War. His connections to the railroad and timber interests made him wealthy by the standards of rural Tennessee. By 1872, he owned 4 properties in Hancock County, including the original Collins farm, which he had converted into a profitable cattle operation. He built a fine 2-story house in Sneedville, married a woman from a respectable Knoxville family, and served 2 terms on the county commission. He was 53 years old and had not thought about Vardry Collins in over a decade when he vanished on the night of October 14, 1872. The evening began ordinarily enough. Dalton had spent the day in Sneedville conducting business. He had recently acquired timber rights to another tract near Powell Mountain and was negotiating contracts with a logging company from Virginia. He dined at the Hancock Hotel with 2 business associates, staying until nearly 9 o'clock. The night was clear and cold, the first real frost of autumn glittering on the ground. Dalton's horse was stabled at the hotel, and he planned to ride the 8 miles back to his house on the Collins property, where his wife and 2 children were waiting. He never arrived. The next morning, when Dalton failed to appear for a scheduled meeting, his business partner rode out to the Dalton house to check on him. His wife said he had never come home. They found Dalton's horse still in the stable at the Hancock Hotel, his saddle and gear undisturbed. His last known location was the hotel itself, from which he had departed on foot around 9:15, intending to walk the short distance to the stable. Sheriff Porter Hensley, the same man who had dismissed Calvin Goins's complaint 11 years earlier, organized a search. They found nothing. No body, no signs of struggle, no blood, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual. Dalton had simply ceased to exist between the hotel door and the stable, a distance of perhaps 100 yards along Sneedville's main street. Theories abounded. Robbery, though nothing was taken, Dalton's wallet containing $70 and several banknotes was found in his hotel room. He had never retrieved it before leaving. An accident, though no body turned up in any of the likely places a man might fall and die. Foul play related to his business dealings, though no enemies could be identified who would benefit from his death. The investigation lasted 2 weeks before Hensley closed the case as an unexplained disappearance. Dalton's wife inherited his properties. Life moved on. But up on Newman's Ridge, something had changed. There was a stillness in the Melungeon community, a quality of watchful waiting. When word of Dalton's disappearance reached the scattered cabins and farms, people said little. They went about their work. They tended their children. They asked no questions. Only Zachariah Collins, now nearly 40 years old, allowed himself a moment of private satisfaction. He stood on the steep hillside where his family's rough cabin perched, looking down toward the valley where his grandfather's farm had once flourished. He thought about his father, dead these 9 years. He thought about his mother, buried beside him in the small cemetery where Melungeons laid their dead. And he thought about how some debts take a lifetime to repay, but they always come due. The next disappearance came almost 3 years later, in August of 1875. The victim was a man named Tobias Fletcher. Fletcher had been one of the surveyors who redrew property boundaries in the late 1850s, working for the Rogersville Timber Company. His surveys had displaced at least 7 Melungeon families, including the Mullins clan. Fletcher was known for his meticulous work and his complete lack of sympathy for those who lost their land. When asked once by a newspaper reporter how he felt about the families his surveys displaced, he had replied, "I draw lines where the law and mathematics dictate. I am not concerned with who stands on which side of those lines." By 1875, Fletcher had retired from surveying and operated a small general store in Jonesville, Virginia, just across the state line from Hancock County. He was 61 years old, a widower, and lived alone in rooms above his store. He disappeared on a Saturday evening after closing his shop. His body was never found. His store was locked from the inside, his cash drawer untouched, his living quarters showing no signs of disturbance. It was as if Tobias Fletcher had simply been erased from existence. The Lee County Sheriff conducted a brief investigation, but with no evidence of a crime and no body, there was little to pursue. Fletcher had no close family, and few people mourned his passing. The store was sold to settle his debts, and within a year, people had trouble remembering exactly when he had vanished or why anyone had cared. Up on Newman's Ridge, Daniel Mullins planted an apple tree that fall. It was a good tree, grafted from old stock, and it would bear fruit for decades. Mullins never said why he planted it that particular autumn, but he tended it with unusual care, and years later, he would sit beneath its shade and remember the land his family had lost and the man who had drawn the lines that took it away. The disappearances continued, but not with any regular pattern. That was part of what made them so difficult to connect, so easy to dismiss as unrelated incidents across 2 states and multiple counties. Months, sometimes years, would pass between vanishings. The victims seemed to have nothing in common: different ages, different occupations, different towns. But they did have something in common, if anyone had cared to look closely enough. Each man had, at some point between 1850 and 1865, participated in the dispossession or abuse of Melungeon families. Each had prospered from that participation, and each disappeared so completely that not even their bones were ever found. In March of 1878, Benjamin Chadwick vanished while traveling between Kingsport and Rogersville. Chadwick had been a deputy sheriff in the 1850s, known for his enthusiastic enforcement of eviction orders against Melungeon families. He was fond of saying that the Ridge people needed to learn their place or be taught it. In November of 1880, Samuel Pritchard disappeared from his farm near Cumberland Gap. Pritchard had led the logging crew that burned out 3 Melungeon families in 1862, claiming they were squatting on timber company land. One of those families had included a young woman named Martha Collins, Zachariah's cousin. Martha and her 2 children had died the following winter from exposure and starvation. In June of 1883, Leonard Garrett vanished while fishing in the Powell River. Garrett had served as a magistrate in Hancock County during the late 1850s, and he had signed off on dozens of property transfers that stripped Melungeon families of their land. His fishing equipment was found on the riverbank. His body was not. With each disappearance, the investigation followed the same pattern: brief, perfunctory, and ultimately fruitless. Sheriffs and magistrates would make the required inquiries, find no evidence of foul play, and close the cases. If anyone noticed that the victims all had connections to the Melungeon dispossession of decades earlier, they said nothing about it in official reports. But people noticed. In the taverns of Sneedville and Jonesville, in the timber camps and rail yards, men began to whisper. They spoke of retribution, of old wrongs being avenged, of the Ridge people taking back what had been stolen. Some said it was nonsense. The Melungeons were too passive, too beaten down, too scattered to organize anything like systematic revenge. Others were not so sure. They remembered the silence of Newman's Ridge, the way Melungeon men watched without seeming to watch, the way information traveled through those mountains without anyone apparently speaking. And some men, those who had participated in the old land grabs and violence, began to feel the first cold touches of fear. They started locking their doors at night. They traveled in groups. They became careful about who knew their routines and movements, but fear, they would learn, was not the same thing as safety. The architects of the disappearances, for that is what they were, architects, not simple murderers, had learned the lessons of their own persecution. They knew that organization was vulnerability, that records were evidence, that loose talk was betrayal. So they operated without structure, without meetings that could be infiltrated, without any written trace. The method was elegant in its simplicity. A man would be chosen, his habits studied for months or even years. Not by a single watcher who might be noticed, but by the community itself. Melungeon farmers who sold vegetables in town, children who played in the streets, women who cleaned houses and heard conversations. Information flowed back to Newman's Ridge in 100 small streams, none of them individually notable, all of them collectively comprehensive. When the moment came, it was never random. The target would be isolated through circumstance that seemed natural. A road traveled alone, a night spent away from family, a routine that created predictability. 2 or 3 men would move with the silence learned from generations of hunting these mountains. There would be no confrontation, no dramatic accusation, no opportunity for the victim to fight or cry out. And then the most crucial part, disposal. The mountains held countless places where a body might rest undisturbed for decades or centuries. Abandoned mine shafts, limestone caves with underground streams, forest hollows where even deer feared to tread. The men of Newman's Ridge knew these places intimately. They had been hiding their own existence in these mountains for generations. Hiding someone else's death was simply another form of the same skill. Just when we thought we had understood the pattern of these calculated disappearances, something would happen to remind us that vengeance, once unleashed, does not always follow the careful plans of those who invoke it. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens when the line between justice and murder becomes too blurred to see. What happened next would prove that even the most carefully controlled revenge can slip beyond the grasp of those who believe they command it. By 1885, 13 men had disappeared under circumstances that defied explanation. The authorities in eastern Tennessee and southwestern Virginia had begun to recognize, however reluctantly, that something systematic was occurring. That recognition, however, did not translate into understanding or effective investigation. The problem was evidence, or rather the absolute lack of it. In 13 vanishings spread across 3 counties over 13 years, investigators had found not a single body, not a single witness to violence, not a single physical trace that would indicate foul play. Some of the men had disappeared from their own homes, others had vanished from public spaces in broad daylight. The locations and methods seemed to have no pattern. What the authorities did not know, what they could not know without understanding the deep history of the region, was that every single victim had participated in crimes against Melungeon families. The pattern was there, but it was written in land deeds, court records, and private letters scattered across decades and multiple jurisdictions. No single investigator had access to all the pieces, and even if they had, the social prejudice of the era would have made it difficult to recognize the Melungeons as anything other than a vague, mixed-race population of no particular consequence. But there were a few people who began to see the pattern. One of them was a young lawyer named William Shepherd. Shepherd had grown up in Knoxville and had moved to Rogersville in 1883 to establish his practice. He was 31 years old, ambitious, and intelligent enough to recognize that unusual cases could build a reputation. When the widow of Samuel Pritchard approached him in 1885 about having her husband declared legally dead so she could settle his estate, Shepherd agreed to take the case. In preparing the death declaration, Shepherd had to document the circumstances of Pritchard's disappearance. This led him to review the sheriff's investigation file, which was thin but contained one interesting detail. Pritchard had disappeared shortly after receiving a threatening letter. The letter had been dismissed by investigators as the work of a crank, but Shepherd obtained a copy from Mrs. Pritchard. The letter was short and unsigned. "You took what was not yours to take. You burned what you had no right to burn. Debts unpaid do not disappear, Mr. Pritchard. They merely accumulate interest." Shepherd was intrigued by the phrasing, "You burned what you had no right to burn." It suggested that the writer knew specific details about Pritchard's past. A little research into Pritchard's history revealed his role in the 1862 evictions and burnings in Hancock County. This discovery prompted Shepherd to look at the other disappearances with fresh eyes. He spent weeks traveling to county courthouses, reading through old newspapers, interviewing people who remembered the missing men. A picture began to emerge. Ephraim Dalton acquired multiple properties formerly owned by Melungeons through dubious legal means. Tobias Fletcher, surveyor whose work displaced Melungeon families. Benjamin Chadwick, deputy sheriff who enforced evictions with excessive violence. Leonard Garrett, magistrate who signed off on fraudulent property transfers. The list went on. Not every missing man had such clear connections. Some required deeper digging to uncover their roles in the displacement of Melungeon families, but the pattern was undeniable once Shepherd knew what to look for. In November of 1885, Shepherd took his findings to Judge Marcus Caldwell of the Tennessee Circuit Court. He presented his research in a lengthy memorandum, arguing that the disappearances were connected and represented a systematic campaign of retribution against those who had participated in the persecution of Melungeons decades earlier. Judge Caldwell read the memorandum. He asked Shepherd several penetrating questions, and then he locked the document in his desk drawer and told Shepherd to drop the matter entirely. "Mr. Shepherd," Caldwell said, "you are a young man with a promising future. I would hate to see that future compromised by an ill-advised crusade. These disappearances, tragic as they may be, are unsolved criminal matters, if indeed they are criminal matters at all. Several of the men simply walked away from their lives. Others met with accidents that have yet to be discovered. The connection you have drawn is tenuous at best and potentially libelous at worst." "But, sir," Shepherd protested, "the pattern—" "The pattern," Caldwell interrupted, "is your own construction. You have drawn lines between events that may or may not be related. More importantly, you have identified a potential perpetrator, a population that has already suffered considerably and which has no legal standing to pursue grievances through proper channels. If you make these allegations public, you will be painting a target on an already vulnerable community, and I can assure you that certain powerful interests in this state will not take kindly to accusations that their past business dealings were improper, even if those dealings were with—" He paused, searching for the word. "With people of uncertain racial classification." Shepherd left the meeting frustrated, but not entirely surprised. He understood the reality. Officially investigating his theory would require acknowledging that serious crimes had been committed against Melungeons, which would in turn require recognizing them as a legitimate community with legal rights. That recognition would open questions about land titles, about the validity of decades of property transfers, about whether Tennessee had systematically defrauded an entire population. The economic and legal implications were staggering. It was easier to let the missing men remain missing, to chalk their disappearances up to individual tragedies or mysteries, to avoid asking questions that might overturn settled expectations. But Shepherd was young and idealistic enough to believe that justice mattered more than convenience. He continued his research, now even more determined to understand the full scope of what had happened, and what was, perhaps, still happening. His investigation took him eventually to Newman's Ridge itself. Shepherd was not naive enough to simply ride into the Melungeon community asking questions about murders. Instead, he used the pretext of legal business. Several Melungeon families were attempting to regain title to lands they had lost decades earlier, and Shepherd offered his services at minimal cost to help them navigate the legal system. It was a genuine offer. Shepherd believed the land seizures had been unjust, and he thought that with proper legal representation, some of the original claims might be restored. But it was also a way to gain access to the community, to hear their stories firsthand, to understand what had been done to them. Over the following months, Shepherd became a familiar figure on Newman's Ridge. He visited farms and cabins, took statements, reviewed old deeds and documents that families had preserved. He heard stories that made his blood run cold. Not just stories of lost land, but of violence, sexual assault, families torn apart, children who died from exposure after being driven from their homes. And slowly, very slowly, the people of Newman's Ridge began to trust him. One evening in March of 1886, Shepherd was invited to dinner at the home of Thomas Collins, Zachariah's younger brother. The meal was simple but well prepared, and Thomas's wife, Eleanor, proved to be a gracious host. After dinner, Thomas and Shepherd sat on the porch while the sun set over the ridge, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "You have been asking a lot of questions, Mr. Shepherd," Thomas said quietly. "People have noticed." "I am trying to understand what happened," Shepherd replied. "To help if I can. Some things cannot be helped by lawyers. Some debts cannot be paid in courtrooms." Shepherd chose his words carefully. "I know that men have disappeared, men who hurt your community. I know that those disappearances have never been solved." Thomas Collins was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the gathering dusk. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrows and older decisions. "My father lost everything because men decided we did not deserve to own land. My mother died in a shack that was not fit for animals. My cousin Martha and her children froze to death after men burned their home for sport. My brother's wife was attacked. She never spoke again after what was done to her. These things happened, Mr. Shepherd. They happened to real people, to families with names and histories and dreams, and no one was ever punished. No one even tried." "I understand," Shepherd said softly. "Do you?" Thomas turned to look at him directly. "Do you understand what it means to watch your father die of a broken heart? To know that the men who destroyed him are prospering? To realize that there is no law, no court, no authority that will ever give you justice?" "No," Shepherd admitted. "I suppose I do not truly understand that. But I understand that what was done to your people was wrong. I understand that the law failed you. I understand that when institutions fail, people find other ways to balance the scales." Thomas studied him for a long moment. "You are asking dangerous questions, Mr. Shepherd. Questions that could lead to answers you might not want to know." "I am not looking to prosecute anyone," Shepherd said. "I am looking to understand, and perhaps to ensure that what happened to your community is never forgotten, even if it cannot be officially acknowledged. And if you discover things, if you come to know things that should remain unknown, then I will keep them to myself. I give you my word." Another long silence fell between them. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and the wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant voices. "My brother Zachariah might be willing to talk to you," Thomas finally said. "He is the one who remembers everything. But you must understand, if he talks to you, it will not be confession. It will not be evidence. It will simply be one man telling another man a story. Do you understand the difference?" "I do." "Then I will speak to him. If he agrees, someone will find you and bring you to a place where you can talk. But Mr. Shepherd, whatever you hear, whatever you come to believe, you must understand that some stones are better left unturned. Not because the truth is shameful, but because the truth is a weapon, and weapons in the wrong hands cause more harm than the original wounds they were meant to avenge." 3 days later, a young Melungeon boy found Shepherd in Sneedville and told him that someone wanted to meet him at an old hunting cabin up on the ridge. Shepherd followed the boy through the forest for nearly 2 hours, climbing higher into the mountains than he had ever gone before, until they reached a clearing where a small log structure stood surrounded by ancient trees. Zachariah Collins was waiting for him. Zachariah Collins was 53 years old when William Shepherd met him in that remote cabin. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through his dark hair, and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked upon. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard work, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was educated and precise. Whatever else the Melungeons had lost, they had never lost their pride in language and learning. "Mr. Shepherd," Zachariah said, gesturing to a rough wooden chair, "my brother tells me you can be trusted. I hope that is true for both our sakes." "I will not betray any confidence you share with me," Shepherd said, settling into the chair. "Confidence." Zachariah smiled faintly. "An interesting word. It suggests trust, but also secrets. I suppose that is appropriate." He poured 2 cups of water from a clay pitcher. "Tell me, Mr. Shepherd, what do you know about justice?" "I know it is supposed to be blind. I know it is supposed to be equal under law." "Yes, supposed to be. But we both know that theory and practice diverge considerably, particularly when it comes to people like mine." Zachariah drank from his cup. "I was 19 years old when I watched my father lose everything he had built. I watched him try every legal means available to regain what was stolen. I watched him spend the last dollar he possessed on lawyers who filed motions that were never heard by judges who had already decided that people like us had no standing before the law. I watched him die, broken and poor, on land too steep for decent farming, in a shelter that barely kept out the winter wind." "I have heard similar stories," Shepherd said carefully. "Have you? How many stories, Mr. Shepherd? Can you name 40 families? 50? Because I can. I can tell you their names, their histories, what was taken from them, and who did the taking. I can tell you about children who died from exposure, women who were assaulted, men who were beaten or murdered when they tried to resist. I can tell you these things because I have spent 30 years remembering them, documenting them, ensuring that they would never be forgotten even if they could never be officially acknowledged." Zachariah stood and moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. He opened it and withdrew a leather-bound journal, thick with pages. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a record," he said. "Names, dates, properties, crimes, everything that was done to my people between 1850 and 1865. I have been keeping it since I was 20 years old. Every time I learned of another family dispossessed, another person harmed, I wrote it down. Not for any legal purpose, I had no illusions about the law, but because I believed that truth has value even when it has no power." Shepherd opened the journal carefully. The pages were covered in neat handwriting, each entry meticulously dated and detailed. He saw names he recognized: Ephraim Dalton, Tobias Fletcher, Samuel Pritchard, all the men who had disappeared, alongside descriptions of their actions against Melungeon families. "This is extraordinary," Shepherd said. "This could be evidence." "Evidence of what?" Zachariah interrupted. "Of crimes that no court would prosecute? Of theft that was sanctioned by the state? Mr. Shepherd, that journal is not evidence. It is simply a record of suffering. What you choose to understand from it is your own concern." Shepherd continued reading. The entries were devastating in their cumulative detail. Each individual incident might seem minor in isolation, a questionable survey here, a disputed property line there, but together they painted a picture of systematic destruction of an entire community. And then Shepherd noticed something else. In the margins of certain entries there were small marks, simple symbols that looked like crosses or check marks. He flipped through the pages and saw that 13 entries bore these marks. Each marked entry corresponded to a man who had disappeared. Shepherd's throat went dry. He looked up at Zachariah Collins, who was watching him with an expression that revealed nothing. "I see you have noticed the marks," Zachariah said quietly. "What do they mean?" "They mean that some debts have been paid. Not through courts, not through law, but paid nonetheless. Zachariah sat down across from Shepherd. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Shepherd. It is only a story, you understand, not evidence, not confession, simply words between two men in a cabin on a mountain." Zachariah spoke for nearly an hour. He described how, in the years after the war, a small group of Melungeon men had made a decision.